The guy who's shouting in the
Really,
corner.
did not?
I've not seen
Okay,
that. That's like 1970
right,
SNL.
sorry.
Okay.
been a while. Good evening and welcome to the Planning Commission of Lake Stevens, Washington, November 5th, 2025. I am Chair Huxford, and I would love to call a call to order beginning with Commissioner Connor Davis.
Commissioner Connor Davis is present.
Let's keep moving alongside Commissioner Bueller. Commissioner Moore.
Present.
Commissioner Jennifer Davis. Present. And of course, I am present. We are missing Commissioner Packard at this point, who I see indication is running through the parking lot. And at this moment, And Commissioner Packard is present. Thank you. Call to order and roll call are being done. If you would all join me with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. We are going through the agenda this evening as printed. There are no changes to the agenda, correct? Excellent. Do we have any guest business? Anybody in the audience or online that would like to address anything that is not on our agenda? Hearing none, seeing none, we'll move forward. Thank you for being in our audience. We appreciate that. Our action items next are number 4. Has everybody had a chance to review the minutes from our October 15th meeting? Any changes to those minutes that you'd like to make for the record? Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve? That would be Commissioner Morton. Do we have a second? Second, all those in favor? Any opposed? Any abstain? Excellent. We have been doing this in record time. Some of us are still catching our breath. We will move on to the public hearing. Do I have a motion to open the public hearing? Do I have a second? All those in favor? The public hearing is open. We are going to review STEP and co-living housing code amendments. Public hearing, LUA 2025-018. Another comment, call you.
All right, thank you, Chair. David Levitan, Principal Planner. I'm not quite sure if this is working, so I'll just go ahead and project. But we are having our public hearing tonight for STEP housing and co-living housing. And I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to breeze through a number of these slides, given that you've seen, the commission has seen most of these, and we do not have additional people in the audience kind of here for the STEP housing meeting. So just a quick overview of the agenda tonight. Obviously, the staff presentation, an opportunity for public comments, planning commission discussion and deliberation, and then a recommendation to the city council is the action that we are looking for from the planning commission this evening. So this is a slide that you've seen before. It just goes over what comprises STEP housing. So a reminder that STEP housing is required by the Growth Management Act as amended by House Bill 1220 back in 2021. The S stands for shelters, the T for transitional housing, the E for emergency housing, and the P for permanent supportive housing. Shown this map before, but basically the red area shows zones that the city is required by state law to allow for emergency housing and shelters, which is basically any zoning district in the city that allows for hotels. There are some general parameters as far as the development regulations and supplementary use regulations that you are allowed to adopt for this type of housing. So whereas emergency housing and emergency shelters are only permitted in very limited areas of the city, basically our sub areas, transitional and permanent supportive housing is permitted in most of the city, basically everything except for the black areas that aren't filled in. So essentially everywhere except for our public, semi-public zones, and then our industrial zones up in the northeast corner of the city. Required to be allowed anywhere that either hotels or residential units are allowed, and similar to the last slide, there can be limits on things like occupancy and spacing, intensity of use. And they generally need to be treated like other types of housing, basically can't implement additional design review requirements and a whole lot of other requirements that treat them separately from other types of housing. So just a quick overview, this is something that the commission has seen a number of times. through the spring and summer into fall of 2025. So introduced back in the spring in May and June. And then staff introduced the first draft code language on August 18th. That was discussed, and then it was discussed again on September 17th and October 15th. The general approach that staff has taken and that the Planning Commission has expressed support for is to kind of to split up, basically have two levels of review. Transitional housing and permanent supportive housing are outright permitted uses. They don't require a land use permit. They essentially would just require a building permit. Whereas emergency housing and emergency shelters have a set of supplementary use regulations. They are subject to a type 2 land use permit, an emergency housing and sheltering permit that is identified within the municipal code and then is further discussed within the supplementary use regulations within chapter 1444. A couple of the topics that were discussed probably most the last couple work sessions with the commission was the concept of buffers. The initial discussion that we had was buffers between an individual uses, so individual emergency housing units or individual emergency shelters, establishing a 500-foot buffer between those individual uses. And then back in September and October, there was additional discussion about adopting protective buffers between these emergency housing and emergency shelters and uses such as schools and parks, child care centers, libraries. So there was some discussion at that at the last couple of meetings, and there was not consensus on that issue, but the majority of the Planning Commission expressed support for establishing these protective buffers. I did want to point out, this isn't something, I think we just touched on it very briefly at the last meeting. It kind of got thrown in because it's another item that needs to be adopted by the end of the year, but the concept of co-living housing, kind of the most prominent use and prominent example would be something such as boarding houses, basically defined as residential sleeping units that are independently rented and lockable with shared kitchen facilities. So again, another variety of housing type that the Growth Management Act has established some requirements as far as how cities can regulate these uses. Basically, they're required to be allowed in any zone that allows for multifamily residential development on a lot with 6 or more units. So in the case of Lake Stevens, that's our MFR zone, and then our commercial mixed use zones. So we've amended our permissible use table to allow for this use basically within those zones. So that's included in the draft code language that's included in attachment 1. And then really the only other item that's specifically and prescriptively called out within the legislation was on parking requirements. Basically that cities can't require more than 0.25 spaces per sleeping unit. And so that's been incorporated into our proposed amendments to chapter 1472, which outlines the parking requirements in the city. So attachment, yeah.
Parking limited, that's maximum.
That's a maximum. Correct, yeah. So you cannot require more than 0.25 spaces per sleeping unit.
But they can build more if they would.
They can, yeah, the providers can build more, but our zoning code cannot require more. So sorry for the confusion on that one. So attachment 1 includes the draft code language that we're asking the Planning Commission to review and deliberate and weigh in on tonight. And then if there are any members of the public that would like to provide comment. So again, we talked about, it addresses basically, it amends the permissible uses chapter and the permissible uses table to specifically align our use chapter with the requirements as far as where these uses must be allowed. The parking regulations within chapter 1472 have been updated for co-living housing and then also for the 4 types of step housing. Kind of the most prominent change is the addition of new supplementary use regulations in chapter 1444 within section 1444-100, which outlines all of the additional items and the process that's required for emergency housing and shelters. And a quick overview of that is that requirement for a type 2 permit, the requirement for a 500-foot buffer between individual uses and protected uses, the requirement to prepare a site management plan that addresses where the providers are required to include their contact information. It's required to analyze parking requirements and how they're going to meet that. And it includes an operations and safety plan addressing things like security, access to the site, kind of everything that's involved with kind of maintaining public health and safety related to individual sites. And then there's also sections on nuisance activity and enforcement measures. So a lot of our discussion at the last meeting was related to what might be an appropriate buffer and what uses should be basically subject to that buffer between emergency housing and shelters. So we had looked at a 300-foot buffer, a 500-foot buffer, and a 1,000-foot buffer, which is measured from anywhere along the perimeter of the parcel. And so when we looked at a 500-foot buffer, the yellow areas the red areas are the zones where these uses are permitted. And then the yellow areas are basically areas that would be affected by the buffer where these uses would not be permitted. So the most prominent impact, as we discussed at previous meetings, is on downtown Lake Stevens. When you look at this map, establishing a 500-foot buffer around schools, parks, childcare centers, and libraries would effectively wipe out all of downtown Lake Stevens. It would take out most of the Soper Hill area, kind of a small area of the Lake Stevens Center / Frontier Village area there in the middle of the city, and then kind of primarily just the western portion, and then a portion of the eastern end of the 20th Street Southeast corridor. When we went through this and kind of when staff is preparing its staff report and when it's doing its analysis for a code amendment, it's required to address the findings that are in chapter 1416C, section 075. As we went through that and we looked at that, kind of one of the main things coming out of the state law that's now within the Growth Management Act is that regulations cannot effectively prohibit these uses within zones where they're required to be allowed. And as we've discussed in the past, sub areas seem to be the most appropriate area for these uses, given their proximity to transit and potential proximity to services. When we looked at the 500-foot buffer, and especially within downtown Lake Stevens and the impact that a 500-foot buffer from North Cove Park, where we're at right now, would have, that's essentially what wipes out the entirety of downtown Lake Stevens, which may run afoul of House Bill 1220 as it amended to the Growth Management Act. And so within the recommendation from staff tonight was to maintain the buffers around schools and around childcare centers, but to remove the buffers around parks and libraries. We had also received some feedback from the City Council on September 23rd that had expressed some concerns and some reservations about the concept of buffers. We had kind of verified with the Planning Commission at their last meeting that they still wanted to move forward. So in trying to make our findings and trying to address the requirements of House Bill 1220, this is the staff recommendation that we had come up with, but there is obviously opportunities for the Planning Commission to discuss, deliberate, and to amend the language that's included within attachment 1 if you'd like to further modify any of the code language. So this is showing basically that map again, removing North Cove Park. If you look in the northeast, in the eastern part of the city, the yellow is still over almost all of downtown Lake Stevens, but the area just east of here would allow for these uses, whereas they would have been outright prohibited basically in the entire downtown area. So there still is, a lot of areas that would be impacted by these buffers, but Staff believes that it's more consistent with the state law in that there are the protective buffers, but it doesn't effectively rule out the potential siting of emergency housing or emergency shelters, kind of within the entirety of downtown Lake Stevens. And then it would just open up a couple of additional sites. There was some yellow area that was kind of in the middle of the 20th Street Southeast corridor, but it would have less of an impact there. But again, there would still be sites that would not be allowed to be sited with these uses, but staff believes that it's more consistent with the state regulations. So we touched on this briefly as far as the decision criteria.
Quick questions, Commissioner Connor Davis. The buffer there off of the west side, is that, are those?
So within Lake Stevens, west of Frontier Village?
West of Frontier Village, yeah.
Yeah, so that's actually, there's a large childcare center there. So it's not impacted by the schools. The schools are a little bit farther south. Yeah, and then there's Frontier Heights, which when you obviously take away the park, it's not impacted. But even when Frontier Heights was included, it barely touched it, and it generally overlapped with the buffer that exists already from that childcare center there within the western part of Frontier Village. So kind of the Lake Stevens Center was probably the least impacted by the change, because that childcare center was really what was driving that protective buffer. So again, these are the decision criteria that are included in chapter 1416C, and which are outlined within the staff report. So requires the development code amendment to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. The comp plan that was adopted last November does include specific language related to step housing and other types of housing, such as co-living housing. The code amendment is required to comply with the Growth Management Act. The whole point of this code amendment was to comply with the GMA as amended by House Bill 1220 and House Bill 1998 over the last few legislative sessions. And then the last one is that it needs to serve to enhance the public health and safety. So that's the thought process behind the supplementary use regulations within chapter 1444. As we discussed, the buffer requirements for parks and libraries might have been a little bit more tenuous, and they largely contributed to an overall prohibition of the use, which seems to conflict with the state law. So that was factored into staff's recommendation for their removal and to keep the buffers for just schools and childcare centers. And with that, staff's recommendation is for the Planning Commission to make a recommendation to the City Council on the language within attachment 1, either written as is or with any proposed amendments. Already talked a little bit about removing the protective buffers, and then there is an opportunity for public comment tonight for anyone that would like to provide those comments, either online or in the audience. And following that, the Planning Commission is asked to make their recommendation to the City Council. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let's ask if there are any comments from the public, either online or in person. This would be the time to make yourself known. Hearing and seeing none, I will turn the time then over to questions from the commission. Who would like to begin?
Commissioner Connor Davis. In the actual House bill, it says that you provide off-street parking for half a mile walk of this stop. Then it does a good job of making major transit stop on high capacity transportation system funded. So talked about commuter rail, rapid transit bus. So what do you think of some of these areas? Do they take rapid transit go through downtown? Yeah, never seen rapid go through downtown. I don't know if I'm.
Yeah, so we included that definition in there, but we do not have any transit stops or any other types of use. Anything that's defined in there, we do not currently have within Lake Stevens. there's a possibility that maybe we would get something that would rise to that, probably not anywhere in the foreseeable future. But we wanted to make sure that our development code was consistent. We can add that in kind of a definition for major transit stop. It's already defined within the WAC and the RCW, but we can add that in to our to chapter 1408 if the planning commission would like to make sure that we are reflecting the proper definition for major transit stop and other uses that are other items that are defined within that chapter.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out if they require where bridges are built for them to close to a that's prerequisite for the development of.
No, it's not a requirement. It's basically trying to align with other state legislation from the last few years that exempted parking when you're adjacent or within a half a mile of these types of uses, of these types of major transit stops. So House Bill 1110 related to middle housing, House Bill 1337 related to accessory dwelling units, they all have similar language that you can require parking, but you can't require it if they're within a half a mile of a major transit stop. And in the case of Lake Stevens, we don't have any, so it doesn't apply to us. But if you were, say, in Linwood or Seattle or Everett, there's going to be areas along light rail or bus rapid transit that you cannot require parking because of their proximity to these major transit stops.
Any other questions? Commissioner Davis? Thank you. Commissioner Packard?
Just wanted to go back to, page 18 of the packet. 1444 B4. Talks about substantive changes to site operations, such as an increase in the number of residents served or the duration of stay shall require new application. I thought we had talked about that in a previous meeting. Just that seems ambiguous, right? If you go from 5 to 7 applicants, percentage-wise, that's a big change, but 20 to 22 residents maybe isn't substantive. But I didn't know. Do you see where I am? I'm on.
Yeah, no, I see B4. Yeah, page 18.
Just how do we quantify? Because you say such as an increase in the number of residents served. Any increase in residents served counts as a substantive change.
Any significant.
Again, what is significant?
I'll get a percentage in there.
Yeah, so that
Gonna put a fixed number.
I don't know what that right number is. I just,
yeah, no, I do remember that discussion, so I apologize for the oversight as far as not addressing that in the revised code. Yeah, I mean, the options would be, yeah, we would really have to come up with some sort of definition or some sort of metric that we feel where it's appropriate to differentiate between someone having to essentially account for it in their when they renew their license versus essentially getting a whole new license. And I don't know what that appropriate threshold. I mean, we could remove it and just basically rely on the renewal process, or we could try to come up with a number as far as what we think is appropriate for what tips that threshold to where you need to be basically reevaluated as a new use.
yeah, the trick is that the number of residents is an example of a substantive change.
Yeah.
There could be many different things, and I don't think we want to go in and quantify all of those things. So it seems like, yeah, the best thing to pull out even the example, right? Such as, just take that out altogether. And if you want to leave substantive change to site operations shall require a new application, then yeah, you just leave that up to the permitting process to assess what is substantive and what is not.
Yeah, and there would be an opportunity for us to kind of further flesh that out as far as in the handouts and the materials and the applications. Kind of the administrative procedures part that's not codified, we could give examples just as far as, when somebody's coming back in for renewal, just so they're not surprised and then like, oh, well, I'm only increasing by, I'm going from 100 to 125 residents. It probably, even if it's not codified, if we could at least provide some guidance materials on that. Christy, do you have any thoughts or?
I mean, this lends itself to the discussion you brought up, Commissioner Dewar, about what was happening in Everett, so, I remember that vividly.
My big concern wasn't so much the change, but regular monitoring to that the program that the that the that the unit was operating was something that was monitored, that nurtured, and funded, and staff.
Do you know if the state statute quantifies what is significant? We'll look it up.
It doesn't, and this is something that it doesn't really address that. It doesn't get into prescriptive or specific definitions. This is one of the areas where there is some discretion. Obviously we've given examples from other cities where they just don't require any permit other than a building permit. And then ones that, kind of went the opposite direction and had half-mile buffers between individual uses. So there's been a whole approach. And I think the thought from the legislature was that this was one area where to grant some discretion to local jurisdictions. So we could, keep the substantive changes without a definition. We could get rid of that. Yeah, not have it in there. Yeah, sorry.
There's a couple other places where you use substantive or substantial in the packet. But it's not the only place, so yeah, it seems like you would want to be consistent, and not put any sort of such as, because then you're addressing one particular aspect but not addressing. But I don't know how the city fundamentally handles the phrase substantial or substantive throughout all of our code, right? This is one document, but all of the code, is there stuff like that, and how do we handle that? You don't need to answer that. That was just a thought-provoking question.
No, that's a great question, and we've been going through our process code, and our goal is to eliminate the criteria like that and actually include specific criteria within our code.
Yeah, so even if we, if the direction was that, we're kind of defeating the purpose of that effort by introducing additional kind of subjective language, we could completely remove that section for now, and try to address it, as part of we're introducing kind of the first phase of process code amendment, but we're going to be rewriting the whole chapters of 1416A, 1416B, just, which we just didn't have time to do this year with all the other code amendments that we needed to do, but we do need to do a larger scrub of all that language. And so, we wouldn't have any renewals within the next, couple years. So we would have some opportunities to try to refine that section and amend it as needed. There's nothing that would preclude us from, as part of a, process code phase 2, to come back into this section and try to do some additional research or try to come up with some more clear and prescriptive language that we feel captures most situations and scenarios. So happy to, whatever direction the commission provides, happy to, try to get rid of all that subjective language that references substantial and substantive, and kind of clean that up in this version.
Commissioner Dewar, I think it's very difficult to come up with a fully complete list. And so So, you know, I've always liked the phrase, including but not limited to. And then, you know, you throw out a couple of the good examples about, you know, what would trigger it, but that's not an inclusive list. So there may be other things that, you know, this body or planning, you know, as a whole doesn't think about, but that's at least gives it, or the flexibility to the city. Okay.
Yes. Mr. Davis has a comment, and then Commissioner Morton.
This is Commissioner Jennifer Davis, and I was just going to say that I'm leaning more towards the idea of removing that provision, based largely on section F, which is the complaints and enforcement section.
What page is that?
That would be 19 and 20 bridges though. And subsection 3 allows for revoking applications that have been misrepresented or misleading information. So that paired with the renewal every 2 years and this ability for neighbors to say, hey, what's going on here isn't right. I want to complain to the city. And then the city looking at what the application initially said, oh, it's supposed to be 20 people, there's 80 people here. To me, there's enough enforcement provision in there to make it possible to eliminate what seems like it could be that comes property, which are property.
So F two, the up to 20. If a new emergency house that's going to copy of that the wording, like, once it's been revoked a year later, perhaps extended to there.
That they need to apply.
That, yeah, that language they need to reapply.
Yeah.
This is Commissioner Jennifer Davis again. Before I forget, I wanted to say that I would also lean towards accepting staff recommendation about removing schools and libraries from the property. Because I do think that there's a danger of us running afoul, as you pointed out, of the House bill. And that's so, before the revisions happen.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it would be parks and libraries, schools,
Oh,
and
sorry.
and childcare centers would still stay in. And the,
Recommendation. You're getting so
It's excited. Yeah.
I know. Commissioner Morton.
I don't have much to say. I agree with the amendment, and I think the comments that made that are really insightful. So, but I haven't.
And I would concur, Chair Hexford, my concerns were parking, and I think those have been addressed. And then the idea of re-permitting, I think leaving it open-ended has some concerns built into that, so those have been addressed. So are there any other discussion comments before we close the public hearing? Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask our planning team, are you asking us for a clear, definite, proposal regarding whether or not that one substantive, not substantive is going to be in that? Is that something you're looking for?
yeah, or at least direction. Yeah, I mean, either specific code language or incorporating into your recommendation that B4 be completely eliminated, or that a portion of that be eliminated, or a general direction to staff to remove any references to substantive or substantial increases or improvements, you know, in the interest of not introducing additional subjective language that would be hard to enforce. So there's a couple different ways that you can do it. I mean, the more specific direction you can provide, the better, just because we want this to reflect your recommendation to city council. So if you want to wordsmith it, if you want to completely scrub it, it's kind of up to you.
Right now, we're in public discussion,
Yeah.
although we can close that and then have our own discussion. We're marrying the two tonight,
Sure.
so why don't we ask one more time if there's any public discussion online? there any public discussion in the audience? Hearing none, let's move to, actually, I don't even need your permission. We're going to close the public discussion. How about that? All right. So now it is our time to massage the wording. I will just let you know, and I'll start off, and then we can go from there, that I would prefer that we leave the 500-foot buffer downtown simply because we don't have public transit. And I think that once we concede that, downtown's flavor may change. However, I am not going to hold up this process for my personal feelings. Other than that, I think it, as written with some wordsmithing tonight, with these comments that have come up, which have been very insightful, would be needed, and I would submit recommendation for. So take it from there, Commissioner.
This is Commissioner Dewar. I know, I recognize that I perhaps was one of the strongest advocates of strong language with regard to buffer zones and restrictions. However, on hearing the potential for litigation around this, I would concede to the recommendation of staff on this matter. In my personal opinion, I would rather retain strong language and some buffer versus potentially losing all buffer and having no language post an expensive round of litigation. So,
Thank you. Mr. Packard, do you want to look at what the wording is and perhaps wordsmith that tonight, or just simply make the recommendation that it be massaged moving forward? It sounds like staff is saying that they can move forward with what has been submitted to us and have, if we approve, and that we've got time to adjust in the future. I don't particularly care to adjust things in the future.
I wasn't necessarily volunteering myself to go do that wordsmithing. I was going, well, may I propose that we try and reach a resolution on the buffer issue first and resolve that, make sure we're all aligned, and then move to it.
So the buffer being 500 feet, except for parks and libraries. So, do I have approval? I don't know if I need a motion for that. How do we feel about that? Let's say a yay or nay. Commissioner Packard.
Yay.
Commissioner Connor Davis. Commissioner Dewar. Commissioner Moore. Commissioner Jennifer Davis. And I am begrudgingly yes. So that person.
Okay, on the other topic related to the ambiguous language, yes. So we have potential proposal to say, including but not limited to, right? Two, you could just take out what you were proposing, take out all of section 4 altogether versus just taking out the example of such as an increase in the number of residents. Commissioner Jennifer Davis, you had said you proposed, put words in that. Can you repeat what you had said you had proposed? And then I couldn't quite make the connection to your rationale of the F3. I wasn't making the connection with those two comments.
So I just feel nervous when you see you said that this is I've seen some boxes that as you pointed out. And so
Page 18, B4.
right, so what I'm proposing that we consider is just removing before things because I believe that the fact that the applications we need every 2 years and this subcommittee subsections of the fencing enforcement. So it represents the two parts that we can talk about is one, the actually has to reapply every 2 years. And secondly, it's something that arrive that is wildly substantively or substantially like what applicant proposed. Before the last is an opportunity for neighbors or the public to within the city. But it's a pretty strong state here for the city to do it, needs to, in terms of revoking the current impact within the city. So, I guess maybe if you want to get this modified, and I'm not sure what's that is about the revenue in order to wordsmith that section.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you clarifying. I understand it, Dan, what you're saying there. So if I'm playing devil's advocate, in theory, someone could get a new application and immediately then make a substantive change, and they would have 1 year and 11 months of no impact before they would have to reapply. Before that time, they could sell the business or whatever the entity is. And then whoever's buying it then is stuck with a bag.
In the meantime, the neighbors are stuck with what's going on.
And it could
It's
say,
neighborhood is initiated in the city.
They could pull the permit though.
Yeah, and that was
But
the
it's citizen
intent,
initiated.
the very last
have to be.
section there about, yeah.
Well, the thing is that, no entity who's running, if any of this stuff helping it with the cover, is gonna report on themselves if they've noticed something.
Okay.
So the enforcement in reality is going to be coming from the neighbors for, unless the city's planning on protecting over time. I don't know what the active process of that would be.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a, kind of a monitoring and specific enforcement program. That's something that we could do potentially administratively if desired. It's,
Right. And as far as the sale of a facility, I feel like this is.
I'm just bringing up an extreme example, just
Right,
to
but
make.
it would be due diligence on the part of the buyer,
Yeah.
but actually,
So I'm gonna add another wrinkle then as another option. If you say any substantive change to the site operation shall require new application, essentially you need to add something that says, an application is required prior to making the change or within 30 days of the change or something like that to avoid this 2-year gap. And it doesn't actually solve your problem, but it prohibits somebody from saying, oh yeah, I just filled out an application, now I can do whatever I want. Don't worry about it. I'm not saying that's the right answer. It may be to just pull it out altogether to your point, but if you are gonna leave it in, it seems like some other temporal provision in prevent someone from using it to do something.
Interesting discussion. Other thoughts?
I would just, question one, I'd be in favor of,
For sure, Dewar, how do you feel?
Well, I mean, so 3 does require, any new app, or a renewal, be in compliance. Then F1, F1, is remediation and code enforcement. So if somebody does, if somebody misrepresents, then that's a whole nother section. Right? If somebody gets their permit, decides to expand the property after 6 months, and that expansion becomes an issue, then they have, for the residents, nearby residents, the ability to code enforcement resolve their concerns that way. I understand the concerns about subjective language. Sometimes I that's the subjective language. But I stand by that closing line.
You like the limited,
Examples, for
Exactly.
example, but not limited to.
but not limited to?
this is Commissioner Jennifer Davis again. Would it, and I'm putting this kind of agnostically, would it be helpful to shorten the time horizon for renewal of any of them? And how onerous is the application process gonna be? Or if we're not allowed to legislate them that's out of existence, so
Yeah, I mean, it's intended to be as quick and easy as possible, if, assuming that the operations are going to be continuing as originally applied for. I think if there's potentially some language that needs to be in there that could replace this language, it could be, whether it's part of the renewal application, or especially if it's prior to when the renewal application is due, that maybe B4 could be replaced. Any request to increase occupancy prior to the necessity of a renewal application will require additional review by the Planning and Community Development Department for, work on some additional language. But if we want to not include kind of the subjective language and more just throw it, hey, if you want to change your operations prior to the expiration of your initial 2-year approval, then it needs to be reviewed for compliance against the supplementary use criteria within this chapter, or something along those lines. Trying to think of kind of the best way to do that. It would potentially get rid of the subjective language, but at least maybe address some of these situations where there's concern that somebody's just going to get approved and then immediately be like, okay, well, we can bump it up by 20 or 25, 30% and just hope that nobody submits a code enforcement complaint. Because that's generally how we're going to find out about these things. So that doesn't mean that necessarily they're going to go through that process, but that's the case for pretty much any use within the city, is that we are generally, for a smaller city with one code enforcement officer, and we rely on the community to report back on these things. So
Could it be as simple as just saying that the changes, if there are changes to the site management plan as defined in the C1, 2 on page 19, would require a new application?
really any change.
Yeah, but I mean, we have our itemized list here. Are you adding more people? Are you changing your background screening or dropping it? Are you providing more services? So those are the things that, I mean, we seem to be dancing.
Keep a 2-year reapplication window because you want them to come back fairly frequently, rather than open-ended indefinitely, assuming no change, right? But you're not introducing that language out that if you're going to change your plan, then you need to reapply.
I think that 1 year is, I'm sorry, but too restrictive. It's too onerous. Anybody, the city included. So a 2-year I would agree with, but I like the idea of just putting in that caveat so they know, we know they know,
Yeah, these are the things that we're looking at. Change them,
and you're it.
then yeah, if you're
No,
changing them, then you
exactly.
need to reapply.
And the application process could be very quick if the change is made. City staff should be able to process that very quickly. And if it's a substantial change, then introducing the level involved.
So do we have specific language of any changes that require, that involve an update to the site management plan, or what? Commissioner Dore, did you have specific? Happy to.
Wait,
The one that concerns me is when they can fly, it's that they as long as there's a range.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And
go back to Commissioner Dewar. Can you, I know, I'm doing that this evening.
Sounded good.
So let's go back to that page. 19. So any changes, any material changes, applicable in section. Yeah, B one, Roman two. Yeah. Would be subject to reapplication.
Prior to,
Prior to reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. Make that, yeah, make that kind of, make it pretty, would you? Yeah,
let's,
yeah.
okay, so change four to that wording. Simplified that wording. Is that how we're comfortable? Takes out substantive. Right, I just created a new word, so let's take that down right now. It addresses, I think, transportation, parking issues. It addresses free permitting. It addresses, we've already talked about the buffers. Are we good?
Yep,
What is it? Lots of work. Great again.
yeah.
Do we have, a motion to approve as amended?
Commissioner Packard will make a motion to approve.
Do we have a second on that?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstain? Thank you. I love our discussions. We're very good. All right, moving on. We have a secondary discussion that you are, going to lead us into, the plan 11 discussion of phase and process coding.
All right, thank you, Chair Huxford. And this is just going to be a really quick discussion. We just want to introduce it. Over the course of the last couple of years, we've checked in somewhat infrequently on what we're calling the process code, basically trying to comply with a variety of different state legislation that's come out over the last few years. The most prominent being our permit review timeline. So that was something that came out of Senate Bill 5290 a couple years ago. It basically changed the way that cities and the timelines that they need to abide by for different types of permits. So type 1 permits, which are fully administrative with no public comment. Type 2, which are administrative with public comment, and then type 3, which are quasi judicial with public comment and public hearing. This was a change that was required by the end of 2024. So what we ended up doing was adopting an interim ordinance to adopt these timelines, and then that gave us another year to incorporate that into our process code. We had hoped to get a little bit farther on the process code, but just with everything else that we did in 2025, we didn't quite get as far along. So we did need to adopt a permanent ordinance to permanently include that language related to the review timeline. So that's what's included within attachment 1. It's basically the interim ordinance that would become permanent. So that's something that would be incorporated into the public hearing and into your recommendation to keep that language on a permanent basis. And then we just wanted to address some other regulatory requirements and some other low-hanging fruit. There was House Bill 1293 that addresses the use of clear and objective language, specifically related to design review. So we went through several different chapters within the municipal code and tried to remove some of that subjective language like substantive and substantial as much as we could. So there are some sections that are included within attachment 2 that try to address that. There also were some, we wanted to align the definitions and our different permit application types. We wanted better alignment between the municipal code and our fees resolution. So we wanted to standardize terms such as plat versus subdivision, just to make sure that there's consistency and everybody is aware. So we went through and made some of those changes. And then there were a couple things specifically related to Design review, that was always a type 1 process. It's listed as a type 1 permit. The way that House Bill 1293 describes design review is it really needs to be an associated land use permit that's completely integrated into either the building permit process or something like a PRD subdivision, which requires design review. You really need to fold it in. It shouldn't be its own land use application. So we shifted that to an associated land use determination just so that it is fully integrated into the larger permit review process and not its own standalone permit requirement. And then for site plan review, which is something that occurs primarily for commercial development and really is essentially just requires applicants to demonstrate how they comply with clear and objective development standards, things like setbacks and landscaping. That's always been a type 2 land use permit, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense because when you're dealing with clear and objective development standards, it doesn't really make sense to be requiring public comments and public notice for something that's essentially, if they can show that they comply with the code, it's going to be approved. So it almost gives false hope to the community that they can comment on something to the point that it's going to get changed. I think there's, potentially the opportunity to still provide comment, but we really want to focus on establishing clear and objective, both design standards and development standards, that if you can meet these, you're going to be approved. And that's the whole intent with a lot of the legislation that's come out of Olympia in the last few years. So we are proposing to shift site plan review from a type 2 permit to a type 1 permit. I look back through all of the site plan reviews, and Chrissy can probably speak to her projects as well. I don't think I've ever gotten a comment on a site plan review before. Yeah, and generally a lot of these applications, they include another permit besides site plan review. And if they're not, so if you say had a new school and it meets all the setbacks, it meets the height, it meets the circulation, the queuing for buses, it meets the landscaping requirements, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be requiring them to go through a type 2 process when they've already demonstrated compliance with the code. So that was our thought on that. There were a couple other items that seemed to be remnants from several codes passed, including plat alterations that were still listed as a type 5 permit, even though a preliminary plat is a type 3. So it doesn't make sense for a alteration for a plat to be a type 5. So we changed that to a type 2 to better align it with our administrative modifications section. So we're for a short plat, which is 9 units or less, can be approved as a type 2 permit, so it doesn't require a public hearing. A long plat, which is 10 or more lots, is a type 3. So it just obviously doesn't make sense if someone wants to alter their plat that they would need to go through a more rigorous process than the initial approval. So those are a couple of the major highlights within what we're calling phase 1 of the process code. So just wanted to share that with you. So we can meet our requirements. We do need to have the code language specifically related to the permit review timelines that needs to be adopted by City Council by December 9th. So we were proposing to bring forward this whole package to the Planning Commission at your next meeting on November 19th for the public hearing. We feel like it's a pretty limited set of proposed amendments, and that would allow us to go to the City Council 3 weeks later on December 9th so that we can get that permanent code language adopted before the interim ordinance expires. So those are just some of the highlights. I didn't want to go through every specific section. I'm happy to answer any questions about code amendments that are proposed within within attachment 2, or any other questions or comments that the Planning Commission has. So thank you.
Thank you for the overview. Were there any questions this evening, knowing that we're going to be discussing further?
Hold my questions for next week.
I'd like to just make one comment. I addressed it last week as part of the commissioner notes, just yeah, talking to people who are looking to either start or move businesses, and burden of moving is so substantial that they either don't want to or can't because it's financially not tenable, right? So they want their business to grow, they want to expand, they want to bring value to the city, but the imposed burden of design criteria and landscaping, and impact fees and all this stuff basically says, I can't, it's not worth the investment. And so we can at least just consider that as we dive deeper into this over the next week or two. How do we minimize that impact as much as possible while still protecting the city in the right way so that everyone's.
Thank you for reiterating that. I remember that from our last meeting. Commissioner Jennifer Davis. Hearing no further comment. Let's move on to commissioner reports. Commissioner Jennifer Davis, let's begin with you.
I wanted to make a comment on the city's View app. Is it Citizen View? We had positive music this week. There was some graffiti in our neighborhood, and the city responded within one day and it was gone, and it was great. So I encourage anybody who has an issue that they want to bring to the city's attention to use that app.
Noted.
Just want to thank everybody for discussing. I think it's really good and real fun.
Congratulations. Pretty, another note, we've never forget the purpose of the life. We are actually staff. It is such a thought right there. All around. It's pretty. Really fun.
Can I actually add to that real quick? This is Jennifer Davis. You're making me think of the high school football team entering the playoffs. What a great group of kids. And I have cause to really love and appreciate Ted Kuga, lineman. So, I will be following the playoffs and so excited for our home team.
I appreciate the congratulations. I don't assume anything prematurely, but it looks favorable. I intend to participate in the planning commission through the end of the year, but we would like to.
And there was a beautiful segue in that I am asking two things, actually. One, if we have an idea of when we're going to schedule interviews for one, and perhaps two, I'd like to be a part of those interviews, and I would need ample notice to make sure that I'm involved in that.
Point noted, and we do have 2 applications for Director Wright. And so under the director's report, I can give a quick update.
Okay. With the potential of having a second opening, would that invitation to apply be then reissued so that they know that they have 2 openings? Or would it be, and we're being preemptive at this point, but would it stand, or would we say that we now have 2 openings?
There would be 2 openings.
Yes, but would we re-advertise that as
Yes.
2 openings?
We would re-advertise.
Okay, I'll make myself as available as possible, and I will enlist Commissioner Jennifer Davis to stand in if I'm unavailable. Because
you.
she would love to do that. And then the other, just housekeeping, we have a meeting on the 19th. Can we ensure that we get the packet the Friday before? Thank you so much. No, I just want to make sure. A lot of us use that weekend to peruse the packet. And I just want to make sure that that is on your calendar. Thank you so much. We cannot have a meeting on the 19th because Commissioner Morton is unavailable. No, thank you for letting us know. All right, with that said, with no other comments from the commissioners, we'll turn it over to the planning director.
Okay, Christy Schmidt on behalf of Russ Wright here, Planning Manager. There are a couple items I wanted you to make aware of for your 19th meeting. It's going to be a double header for a public hearing because I will be bringing back to the Planning Commission also the traffic impact fee along with the concurrency management systems. So that will be being noticed also. We'll do a double notice and it'll be coming back to the Planning Commission for a hearing. In addition, we'll be providing our third quarter report to you along with our 2026 work program. And then we do want to make sure we have a quorum for that meeting since we have 2 public hearings. So I don't know if Planning Commission or if it's best if Dawn sends out a poll to the Planning Commission just to verify that we'll have a quorum.
So we know that we are already down to, is there anybody else that feels like they would be unavailable? I think that we are okay, but certainly let us know early. Thank you.
Perfect. That is it for the director's report.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on, our last agenda item is number 9, adjourn. Who would like to make a motion? And we have a second. Commissioner Morton, Commissioner Connor Davis, all those in favor? No one ever opposes. Thank you.